again, good afternoon, and thank you so much for coming. The information I'm going to share with you this afternoon has been of particular interest for me, particularly as I worked as a clinical dietitian in the hospitals, and I'd have people who were very unsure about whether they were doing the right thing in terms of their diet if they were a vegetarian. The info was actually published in a medical journal of Australia in 2012. Let's get this going. And we had the enormous privilege of being sponsored by Sanitarium and some other organisations who really believe in plant-based diets, and they assisted us in getting this project done. We were able to publish 7 clinically focused articles on plant-based diets, and also we have an editorial in this publication by Rosemary Stanton. All of the articles were included in this supplement, this 40-page supplement, and the Medical Journal of Australia, who was the owner of this publication, sent it out to all of their doctors, their subscribers, and Sanitarium also sent it out to every dietitian in Australia. So over 30,000 people have actually got their hands on a hard copy of this material. We do have, as Nathan has said, we have this material open access on the internet. That means you don't have to pay for the articles. This was a commitment by the Medical Journal of Australia because they feel that this information was just so important for clinicians to receive throughout. And they know, and we know, that this is actually probably one of the first publications of this kind in Australia. So we're very, very proud and very grateful to the sponsors of this project. So how many of you have seen in advertising like this suggesting that meat is an important source of these essential nutrients? In fact, if you don't eat meat, then your brain's not going to develop, apparently. You've probably seen advertising on the TV as well, encouraging everyone to eat meat because it's such an important food, so they say. Australians are told to eat this because this is where you're going to get your protein from, your iron, your zinc, your omega-3, your vitamin B12. So we're led to believe that's the only place you're going to get it, and most Australians believe this. Consequently, concern still exists, not just amongst you and I, general population, but amongst the health professionals, doctors and dietitians who should know this information. So they still believe that nutrient deficiencies will arise if someone follows a vegetarian diet. So how often would you hear, for instance, someone say, my word, if you're a vegetarian, where in the world do you get protein from, or iron? You know, can't possibly be getting that from your vegetarian diet. So today we're going to look at some of the misunderstandings or myths, if you like, and even some of the controversies surrounding vegetarian diets, particularly in regards to its nutrient adequacy. So the first myth or misunderstanding I'm going to address is that vegetarian diets are a passing fad. Well, we've spent the last couple of days, haven't we, looking at the overwhelming evidence behind the benefits of a plant-based diet, particularly in relation to reducing chronic disease and increasing longevity. And I read this quote yesterday from Marion Nestle, who is regarded as really the top nutritionist in America, similar to our Rosemary Stanton here in Australia. And she says, there's no question that largely vegetarian diets are as healthy as you can get. The evidence is so strong and overwhelming and produced over such a long period of time that it's no longer debatable. And then Rosemary Stanton also, you'll find this quote in the editorial at the front of this publication. And she continues to be a tremendous proponent, if you like, of plant-based diets. She's a great colleague to Sanitarium. She's a personal friend of mine. I am indebted to her many, many times for the information that we share. So, and I've said this over and over, that the information is so consistent about the benefits of a vegetarian diet. And this comes from some of the top epidemiologists in America. A Loma Linda physician by the name of Dr. Mervyn Hardinge, a pioneer researcher on vegetarian diets from back in the 1950s. He was actually one of the very first to ever think about doing some research on vegetarian diets. He recently stated, as he was reflecting on how far vegetarian research has come, he said, quote, "Attitudes toward vegetarian diets have progressed from ridicule and skepticism to condescending tolerance, to gradual and sometimes grudging acceptance, and finally to acclaim." Now, I've been working in the area of nutrition, vegetarian nutrition, for 30 plus years, and this has certainly been my experience. And I am just reveling in the fact that now there are many, many organisations, there's research that continues to affirm the benefits of plant-based diets and vegetarian diets. One of the greatest minds in human history, Albert Einstein, has stated, "Nothing will benefit human health and increase chances for survival of life on Earth as much as the evolution to a vegetarian diet." He obviously was a vegetarian. So even though there's convincing evidence around the health benefits of a vegetarian diet, these are some of the misconceptions. First, I need to eat meat to get protein, don't I? Every athlete and bodybuilder knows that. Well, we'll address that in a moment. Secondly, vegetarians are more likely to be iron and zinc deficient than meat eaters. Isn't meat the only or the most important source of iron and zinc? And what about the misunderstanding around B12? If we can't get vitamin B12 from plant foods, then of course we're meant to eat meat. So we'll start with those. We're also going to cover omega-3, calcium and vitamin D. For those who are just not really sure why we use the term plant-based diets, it's actually like the umbrella that covers a number of different types of vegetarian diets. So that's vegan, of course, is where there's no animal foods included. The lacto-ovo-vegetarian diet is mostly plants, but it does include some milk and eggs. Pescatarian is where they may actually include a little bit of fish, but it's mostly plants. And then the semi-vegetarian or flexitarian, which is a new term, and I'll refer to that now as we look at a few of the actual facts. Vegetarian diets are actually the way of the future, so that's not a passing fad. As I've said already this week, I really believe that the greater population, if you like, particularly some of the young people of Australia, are really embracing plant-based diets, vegetarian diets, but I don't see that necessarily within our church, which is a bit of a shame. So there's so much good information now that backs what we say, and yet some of our folk are tending to move away from it. There was a recent survey that was done by Bean Supreme, which is a new company that Sanitarium has recently purchased. They have found that nearly half of adults surveyed have actively tried to reduce meat in their diet. And they found that 1 in 5 consider themselves vegetarian or flexitarian. Now, this word flexitarian, I think it's a term that's been devised by journalists, but it actually means something like they're mostly vegetarian, but they may, on occasions, if they go out to eat somewhere with somebody, they may eat some meat, perhaps. But they're flexible, they're mostly vegetarian. The survey also showed that 1 in 10 Australians considered themselves this flexitarian type of vegetarian. And they give the number one reason is for improving health and losing weight. But they also give other reasons, and that they are animal welfare reasons and also environmental reasons, which I'm hoping to touch on tomorrow if I have time. There was another News Poll survey that Sanitarium commissioned fairly recently where they found that 7 out of 10 Australians are eating more plant-based meals than previously. So I don't think we can say that vegetarian diets are a passing fad. They really are here to stay, and it is becoming much more popular. Let's look at another myth or misunderstanding. You need to eat meat to get enough protein. Well, you know, here's a real man, you know, he's got to eat meat, right? They believe that without meat it's difficult to get enough protein, nearly impossible to get the high quality protein that people need, and certainly difficult for children. Well, we know better, don't we? So let's look at this for a minute. Here's a couple of vegan Ironmen who know that meat's not required to build muscles. I like to show this to young men. I do a lecture at Avondale College and I show them this picture. Yes, even bodybuilders and athletes can get enough protein without meat. Alexander on the right, who was world bodybuilding champion in 2005, relies on plants to get all of his protein and doesn't aim for the high protein diets that other bodybuilders rely on. He says, "My power has increased since becoming a vegan, especially my endurance." And if you do a Google search for vegan athletes, you'll see a number of people who have a very similar testimony about how much better they perform as athletes on a vegan or vegetarian diet. So there are two important questions regarding protein. First, the question around quality of protein. Can we get enough? Quantity. Can we get enough protein from plants, or what we call the amino acids? Amino acids are simply the building blocks of protein. And the second question is, what about the quality of protein? Isn't plant protein inferior to animal protein? So let's look at these questions. First, can we get all the protein we need? Well, absolutely yes. There are 9 indispensable amino acids which our body can't make. They're indispensable because we can't make them. We have to get them from food. There are other amino acids which our body can make, so they're not considered indispensable. Animals also don't make indispensable amino acids. So animals like beef, for instance, they have to get their amino acids from plants. So we get these amino acids either directly by eating plants or indirectly by eating animals. And I think all of us would agree from what we've heard this week that it's far better to get it directly from plants. So the second question is, are plant proteins inferior? Well, as we've said, all plant foods contain all 9 amino acids, indispensable amino acids. But in many plants, 1 or more of these amino acids are limited. Doesn't mean that they're missing, but they may be limited in number, perhaps, in quantity. Now, the exception to that are plants such as soy, quinoa, and amaranth. They have every one of those amino acids without any limitation. So they are considered what we would say high-quality protein. This is the problem with a limited amino acid in plant foods is only significant if you only eat a single plant. If you're eating a variety of foods, there is no issue because you'll be getting a range of amino acids from all the plant foods that you are eating in your diet. And fortunately, here in Australia, we have access to a wide variety of plant foods. So, is protein combining necessary? How many of you remember 20-some years ago, we used to teach that it's important to combine different proteins, legumes with wheat and so forth? See some hands go up. Well, no, we have much better understanding around this now. Protein combining is actually not necessary. Instead, a variety of plant foods over the course of the day, as I mentioned, will provide all the protein that we need, provided we get sufficient calories. And that just simply means as long as you're eating normally, eating well, you're not limiting your intake because you're very unwell, you will in fact get all the protein that you need. Our body has also, marvellously, an internal pool of stored amino acids that our body will draw on when it needs additional amino acids if we haven't happened to eat that for the day. So that's a remarkable thing. God has made us in remarkable ways, and you're going to hear more about how remarkable our body is in terms of adaptation. There are considerable health benefits in choosing plant proteins over animal proteins, and we've gone through that in detail in the last 2 days. So very quickly, plant foods are lower, particularly plant proteins are lower in saturated fat. They have no cholesterol because it's a plant, and they have no heme iron either because it's a plant. They're higher in fibre, antioxidants and phytonutrients, as we learned yesterday, and of course help to reduce chronic disease and obesity. And I want to make special point, it actually helps to reduce your risk of kidney disease as well, because it puts much less pressure or effort on the kidneys to digest plant protein than animal protein. Now, there's a lot of interest these days in high animal protein diets for weight loss, such as the paleo diet, the low-carb diet, the Atkins diet. We're going to look at that in detail tomorrow. They actually claim that you can lose weight because of the fullness that you experience with eating animal protein. But the reality is that eating plant protein also gives you fullness. In fact, you get that mostly because of the fibre that goes along with the plant protein, which you don't get with meat. And of course, it's a much more beneficial form of protein rather than animal protein. And new research is showing that a higher intake of animal protein during childhood is actually associated with an increased risk of obesity in later life. So, with all the things we've learned this week, we know that eating animal protein is not healthy at all for our bodies. So how much protein do we need daily? Well, protein requirements for vegetarians are no different than for meat eaters. The recommended daily intake is no higher, which is a little different from other nutrients we'll talk about in a moment. But vegetarians actually do tend to eat less protein than meat eaters, but that's because meat eaters sometimes may, in fact, eat twice as much or even more than that than they actually need in terms of grams of protein. But vegetarians still get adequate amounts even though we eat less protein than they do in terms of grams. So here are some plant sources of protein. Legumes, and that would include soy, grains such as quinoa, amaranth, and I mentioned that as a high quality protein, nuts and seeds, tofu, tempeh, TVP, textured vegetable protein. There's something called mycoprotein, which is this new corn product. It's a completely different form of plant protein. And then there's the gluten, or seitan as they call it in America. Soy milks, of course, and soy yogurts, soy sausages and burgers. And then for the lacto-ovo vegetarian, eggs and dairy. But obviously if you're eating lots of plants, you don't have to rely on eggs and dairy for your protein intake. So here's just a nice pictorial of all the wonderful plant sources of protein that we have. So just some practical tips. It's important to include a variety of these protein foods throughout the day. If you're a new vegetarian, don't just cut out meat. You have to replace it with something, such as the legumes or the nuts, the tofu. Choose more whole grains instead of the refined grains. Snack on nuts and seeds, or certainly add them to your meals. I mentioned already that I always add nuts to my breakfast cereal. Very important, and seeds. And then soy milk has a similar protein content to dairy, but take note that rice, oat and almond milks are actually lower, quite a bit lower in protein. So, fact around protein, plants actually provide adequate protein for vegetarians. Okay, myth number 3, vegetarians are more likely to be iron and zinc deficient. Iron is often thought of as a nutrient of concern in a vegetarian diet, but is it? There are actually some really surprising new findings and understandings that are described in detail in this MJA paper. And I would say it's probably the most challenging paper that I wrote, but it's also probably the one that I'm most satisfied with. It was so interesting. And so I'll just share with you some highlights from that paper. But first, let's do a quick review. Iron is actually essential for the formation of hemoglobin in our red blood cells. It helps to transport oxygen around the body, so if you're low on iron, obviously you're going to feel quite tired and very listless. Most people don't realise that most of our daily iron requirements comes from the efficient recycling of red blood cells within our body. Now, there are 2 different types of iron that you need to be aware of. There's the heme iron that's found in meat, and then there's the non-heme iron that's found in plants. And plants such as your whole grains, your legumes, nuts, your dried fruits and green leafy vegetables. Also iron-fortified cereals. Now, another point that probably most people don't realise, most meat-eating Australians certainly don't realise that 40 to 45% or most of the iron in the Australian diet comes from non-heme sources. So in other words, primarily from cereal and cereal products, including iron-fortified products, iron-fortified cereal products. Whereas meat only provides about 20% of their total iron intake. Now, this was found in the Australian National Nutrition Survey, which was released in 1995. The updated survey, we've had to wait until this year, 2014. And so I'm anxiously waiting to see what the new data is on where most of our iron comes from. But I assume, and I'm going to guess, that it's probably much the same. When they did this survey in the UK, they also found that most people get their iron from non-meat sources. Now, iron absorption from meals is carefully regulated by our gut. How much we absorb from plants is primarily determined by how much we need or how much we have in our iron stores. Iron stores are what we call serum ferritin. It's a blood test that can be done to measure your iron stores. Now, fortunately, non-heme iron from plants is very, very sensitive to our body's need for iron. We will absorb more if our iron stores are at low. We also absorb more when we need more, for instance, during pregnancy. In fact, by the last trimester of pregnancy, a woman can absorb up to 60% more iron. On the other hand, heme iron from meat is absorbed whether we need it or not. And that, of course, is a problem, as we've learned. It's a problem for most Australians because of its heme iron's link with chronic diseases, as we've talked about over the last 2 days, but also for other people who have real problem with high iron stores. The other thing is that a heme iron is actually an oxidant. It works as an oxidant within our body. So, and we've learned about chronic inflammation and the importance of including anti-inflammatory, antioxidant plant foods in our diet. And obviously, if we're eating a lot of heme iron, you're just adding a lot of oxidant to your body, and which is not good. And that's why this heme iron is actually linked very closely to increased levels of heart disease and type 2 diabetes, as well as colorectal cancer. Okay, so why the concern around iron? Well, globally, iron deficiency is in fact considered the most common nutrient deficiency. Those who are most at risk are those who have an inadequate intake or have increased blood loss or impaired absorption. So first, those who have an inadequate intake, for example, in developing countries where there's a limited food supply or limited variety, it's not uncommon to see iron deficiency in countries like that. And also young women who are on a very restrictive diet. So here in Australia, for instance, typically a young woman who is trying to lose weight and going on some kind of a fad diet where the diet is not properly planned will typically be low in iron. Second, in terms of increased blood losses, one of the main reasons for iron deficiency in women is high or abnormally high menstrual blood loss. And also iron deficiency is also seen in those with undiagnosed celiac disease or colorectal cancer due to associated blood loss that occurs within the gut when you have those diseases. So often if you go to the doctor and you have a unresolved low iron stores problem, one of the first things they need to do is rule out celiac disease or colorectal cancer. Thirdly, in terms of impaired absorption, the concern regarding iron absorption from plants and its potential link to iron deficiency is much more relevant in developing countries and not a significant concern in Western countries, as I'm going to explain now. Some people wonder whether iron from plants is as available or as well absorbed as from meat. There are substances in plants that may in fact limit your iron absorption. For example, something called phytates. Now we now know that phytates are like polyphenols. They're actually an antioxidant, and we find them in large amounts in unprocessed bran, much less amounts in legumes, nuts and whole grains. Now fortunately, a Western diet, vegetarian diet, plant food diet, is naturally high in vitamin C and other substances found in fruits and vegetables. Vitamin C will actually overcome the effects of phytates and help us to absorb the iron from plants. Also, the way we cook foods, the modern cooking and processing methods that we use in our homes, baking, heating, leavening, yeasting, sprouting, all of those actually help to break down the phytate and help us to absorb the iron more easily. So the bioavailability issue, or the absorption issue, is not as significant as we once thought it was, and unfortunately people who are against plant-based diets and vegetarian diets will bring this up as an argument. Oh no, you can't absorb it properly from plants. But hopefully now you've got the answer that you can give them about that. So are vegetarians at risk of iron deficiency? Well, unfortunately our government body, the National Health and Medical Research Council, and the Ministry of Health in New Zealand actually believe that we are, as vegetarians, more at risk for iron deficiency. And they've actually set our iron requirements in the nutrient reference value tables as being 1.8 times higher than for non-vegetarians. But this, amazingly, and something I found in doing my research, was based on very, very limited US scientific evidence, and sadly was not actually even done on vegetarians. So it was very, very poor research evidence to base this higher requirement on. And I actually go into some detail in the article about what the problems were with that actual research. And so we're really stepping out and challenging the National Health and Medical Research Council in relation to iron and vegetarian diets. Research studies looking at iron status have shown that Western vegetarians are no more likely to be iron deficient than non-vegetarians as, and listen to this, we eat as much or more iron than non-vegetarians do. Now, as I've said already, the issue of iron bioavailability is not a concern. The interesting thing is that iron stores for vegetarians do tend to be lower than for non-vegetarians, but they tend to be on the low side of normal, which is perfectly all right, which is actually better than having high levels of iron in our bodies because of its oxidant behaviour. So here are some plant food sources of iron. Legumes, whole grains, that includes whole wheat, it includes amaranth and quinoa and some of those other wonderful grains that we have. Iron-fortified cereals, tofu, tempeh, dried fruits, nuts and seeds, dark green leafy vegetables. Now, I want you just to have a quick look at this little table that I've added in here. A serve of tofu, which is about half a cup, that's 100 grams of tofu, half a cup. A serve of quinoa, a cup of quinoa, or a lamb chop, all have about the same amount of iron in them. And most people wouldn't recognise that, of course. Now, I have to say, in our publication, each of the articles have some wonderful tables that list the food sources, the amount that you get. You'll see meal plans there. There's lots of very practical information. Even though this was written as a scientific paper for doctors and dietitians, this is extremely useful for people who have an interest in nutrition because of all the additional practical pieces of information that we've added in there. So, plant sources of iron. Here they are. That's quinoa on the top left. If you haven't used it already, it's a wonderful, it can make wonderful breakfast cereal. You can even use it in place of rice if you want. You can add it to salads. It's just a marvellous grain. And there's some lovely whole wheat bread on the right-hand side, dried fruits, nuts, etc., and your dark green leafy veggies. So practical ideas, we need to be sure to include some legumes or tofu in our meals on a regular basis. Choose those whole grains instead of the refined grains. Eat plenty of green leafy veggies. Include plenty of vitamin C rich foods, and if you're just eating a nice range of fruits and vegetables, you will already be getting plenty of vitamin C in your diet. And then avoid large amounts of the unprocessed bran because that does have a lot of phytate and it is a rather overwhelming source. So if you're used to putting half a cup or so of unprocessed bran on your cereal, hopefully you don't do that, there's no need to, you will be getting an oversupply of phytate. And also avoid drinking tea, and that includes herb teas with your meals and coffee, because those actually have polyphenols in them. And the polyphenol, which is even an antioxidant, will also lower your absorption of iron. But again, vitamin C will overcome that as well. But it's still better to have drinks in between meals. So the fact around iron is that vegetarians are no more likely to be iron deficient. Okay, now just staying with this myth, vegetarians are more likely to be iron and zinc deficient. So let's look at the zinc part of this now. It is another nutrient that some believe is compromised in the vegetarian diet, and there are lots of similar issues with iron and zinc, I have to say. But so let's look at the facts here. First, zinc is essential for multiple regulatory functions within the body and plays an important role in our immune system. It's also a catalyst for a large number of enzymes in our body. Most of the zinc actually is found in our skeletal muscle and bones, and only 1% of zinc is found in our plasma, in our blood. High concentrations of zinc are found in the eye and also in prostatic fluids. Plasma zinc is very tightly regulated via a homeostatic mechanism within our body. In other words, absorption and the excretion of it through our feces and the distribution of zinc are all very carefully coordinated by our bodies. If zinc balance is not maintained, then zinc is actually drawn from a small zinc pool. So not only do we have an amino acid pool, we also have a zinc pool that God has created us with to help us provide enough zinc for our bodies. The body adapts remarkably by increasing the amount of zinc absorbed according to the amount of zinc that we secrete. So the more we secrete, the more we will absorb. Zinc absorption increases and losses are decreased during times, again, of increased need, particularly when zinc intake is low. So if our diet tends to be a bit low in zinc and our needs are great, we will absorb much more. Amazing. Isn't God amazing? The way He's made our bodies. Zinc deficiency is relatively uncommon in developed countries such as Australia, the US and the UK, but much more common in developing countries where there's a limited food supply and variety. Deficiency can actually reduce your immunity, can stunt growth, and we can certainly see that if any of you have been on mission trips to Nepal or Cambodia, you see the stunted growth there. It can actually affect your taste buds and also your appetite. Now, plasma zinc levels are actually a common measure. So taking a blood level of your zinc levels, plasma levels, is a common measure to determine if you're deficient or not. But actually, in the wider health profession, it's not actually considered a very accurate measure of zinc status. And they're doing work to try and improve the way that they can determine zinc status by taking blood tests. So are vegetarians at greater risk of zinc deficiency? Well, our government again believes that we are as vegetarians. So they this time have set the bar higher at 1.5 times higher requirement than for non-vegetarians. But that higher requirement actually hasn't taken into account the adaptive responses that we have within our body that I just explained to you. Research tells us that Western vegetarians are actually at no greater risk of zinc deficiency. If we include a wide variety of foods, we use the modern cooking methods that I mentioned with iron, that actually also helps your body absorb zinc. And there are a number of substances within a variety of foods, not just vitamin C, but other organic acids within nuts and seeds, and usually in the same foods that have a high amount of zinc as well. And as I've said, we have a lower dietary intake. If we have a lower dietary intake, our body will actually increase absorption and decrease excretion of the zinc. So vegetarians actually have zinc levels that are similar to or even higher than non-vegetarians. So here are some plant sources of zinc: legumes, particularly lentils and soybeans, whole grains like wheat and brown rice, tofu, tempeh, nuts and seeds, and then also you'll get some zinc from eggs and from dairy. Again, a little table of comparison. Here's 100 grams of pine nuts or cashews, has 5.5 milligrams of zinc, similar to a 100-gram serve of lamb chop. And then also pumpkin seeds, similar amount to a 100-gram serve of beef. Interesting that zinc is often concentrated in plant foods that are closely involved with the generation of new life. And I want to bring your attention to also, have you noticed some repetition here in the plant sources of protein, iron and zinc? Can I see a nod or a... Yeah, isn't that interesting? So a lot of the foods that are rich in protein are also rich in iron. Foods that are rich in iron are rich in protein and zinc. Foods that are rich in zinc are often high in protein and iron. So it's amazing. It's not hard work, folks, to get the amount of good nutrition that you need from plant foods. So here's a nice little graphic again. Legumes, your whole grains, your nuts and seeds, your brown rice, and then a little bit of zinc from dairy and eggs if you so desire. So just some practical tips. Important to include legumes and tofu, as I've said before, whole grains, nuts and seeds. Even sprouted legumes are actually a good source of zinc, and they're lovely to put into sandwiches. And again, avoid the excess intake of unprocessed brands. So the fact is that vegetarians are no more likely to be zinc deficient than non-vegetarians. Okay, let's move on to omega-3s. Fish, the myth is that fish is necessary. It's the only way to get omega-3s. Well, let's see. Omega-3s are actually associated with a lower risk of cardiovascular disease, particularly those fatal arrhythmias. So it's important for those reasons. It's also associated with a lower risk of cognitive decline, depression, age-related macular degeneration, bone fractures, and type 2 diabetes. And it's very important for visual and cognitive development, particularly during pregnancy and infancy. Now, vegetarians, as we've learned over the last few days, have a lower overall risk of heart disease, and that's primarily because of lower saturated fat and cholesterol intake and high intakes of phytonutrients. So is it still important for someone at lower risk of heart disease to eat fish? So as vegetarians, do we need to eat fish to get omega-3 if we don't have the risk of heart disease? Some feel we may be at a disadvantage. There is quite a debate out there in the nutrition community. Omega-3 blood levels are, in fact, lower in vegetarians. But the interesting thing is a European study has found that, in fact, they may be lower, but they're very stable. So it's not as if they go down, 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 down. They are quite stable but low. But there appears to be no clinical disadvantage to vegetarians to have that lower but stable levels of omega-3. There's certainly no increased evidence of depression or Alzheimer's or cognitive problems. And remember, Albert Einstein was a vegetarian, and so was Leonardo da Vinci. Okay? Now, since we know that omega-3s are important for health, for all kinds of reasons other than heart disease, let's look now to see if there's any other way to get this important nutrient. First of all, let's review two important essential fatty acids, and I've marked them there in red. You can see alpha-linolenic acid, which we call ALA, and I'll refer to it as ALA from this point on. And then below that, linoleic acid, which we refer to as LA. These are commonly known as polyunsaturated fats. These are essential. You see they're called essential fatty acids. Again, because our body can't make them, we must actually get them from food. So let's look at omega-3 first, ALA. Well, we get that from plants: chia, flax seeds, walnuts, canola, soy, wheat germ, and green leafy veggies. The best sources are chia and flaxseed and walnuts. Then there's another type of omega-3 that everybody hears about all of the time, and that's the EPA and DHA that comes from fish. This is what we call the long-chain omega-3s. And typically the best sources of that is your oily fish. Guess where the oily fish get their omega-3, their EPA and DHA from? The microalgae, the plants in the ocean. So that's actually the original source of EPA and DHA. Okay. So let's look at linoleic acid, LA. That comes from safflower seeds, sunflower seeds, sesame, walnut, soy, and wheat germ. But there's another type of omega-6, and that's called arachidonic acid, which typically comes from animal foods. So notice that both of the essential fatty acids actually come from where? Plants, not animals. So we don't have to eat animals in order to get these essential fatty acids. Just a little reminder, ALA, this omega-3, actually helps to lower cholesterol. EPA and DHA, on the other hand, helps to lower triglycerides. But triglycerides will be lower typically on a plant-based diet. So if we actually try to cut back on all fats in our diet, we're going to actually miss out on some of these essential nutrients. So it's actually important to get some fat in the diet, but we have to get the balance of it right. That's the challenge for us. Most of us, including vegetarians, tend to eat too much of one, the omega-6, and too little of the other, omega-3. So in order to correct this, we need to eat more of the flax seeds, the chia and the walnuts, and less of the refined oils and spreads or margarines that come from safflower and sunflower, corn oils, etc. Now, one reason it's important to get that balance right is because too much of the refined omega-6 from the margarines and oils actually has an inflammatory effect. So it actually contributes to this chronic inflammation we've talked about in the last few days. So it can actually increase your risk of some of those chronic diseases we've mentioned. Whereas, on the other hand, omega-3, which comes from the chia and the flaxseed, etc., actually has an anti-inflammatory effect. And we saw that when we talked about flax seeds and chia seeds being one of those great superfoods. It actually has an anti-inflammatory effect. So it actually helps to prevent cardiac disease, hypertension, even arthritis, and maybe even some cancers. So these two fatty acids, omega-3 and 6, we need both of them because they're essential. They help to regulate inflammation, platelet aggregation and blood clotting, and also contraction and dilation of the blood vessels, so particularly help with blood pressure. Now, the remarkable thing is that our body can actually convert ALA to this EPA and DHA in our bodies. But it won't convert if you have too much omega-6. So that's why it's really important to get that balance right. So eat more flax seeds, don't have so much of those refined oils and margarines, and enjoy the flax seeds. Enjoy the safflower seed, but not the oil. The sunflower seed, but not the oil. Do you get it? Okay. So it is remarkable that our body gets tremendous benefit from this ALA from chia and walnuts, etc., flaxseed, and also will convert into this EPA and DHA. DHA is a very important fat to have in our brain and helps with visual acuity and our brain function, of course. Now, there is a professor in the UK by the name of Tom Saunders who says that our body will actually make DHA when we need it, mostly for our brain. So when he's saying make it, he's talking about making it from the ALA that we will be eating from the flaxseed and the chia, etc. So the important message is to remember that the ALA in plants is important because it does help our body get sufficient amounts of the EPA and DHA. So some food sources, as we've said, chia, flax, canola oil, walnuts. Hemp seed is a very, very good source of this omega-3. It's allowed in America. It's the FSANZ, the Food Authority here in Australia and New Zealand, does not allow hemp seed to be sold. soybeans, wheat germ, and green leafy veggies. And of course, you will get some EPA and DHA from eggs that are fed on fish meal. On the occasion when I buy eggs, if I'm not buying the free range, I might look for some that are fed with flaxseed, and they also have source of EPA and DHA. And their microalgae is also a source of EPA and DHA. So it's important to increase your intake, as we've said. Go for about a tablespoon of flaxseed or chia seed a day. Simple, as it's probably one of the most nutrient-rich foods that gives you the biggest bang for your buck, if you like, and it's so easy to include in your diet. So the tablespoon, limiting the omega-6s. As I've said, no need to limit the whole seed. Use your monounsaturated fatty acids, your monounsaturated oils, such as olive oil, canola, or avocado, in place of the safflower and sunflower refined oils. Olive oil is a very rich source of omega-9. It's not an omega-6, so it doesn't block the conversion. So the fact is that there are plant sources of omega-3. So I would encourage you to start including that if you haven't done so already. Let's look at B12 now. The lack of B12 in plants proves that we need to eat meat. How many of you have been told this? Okay. Okay. Such a fascinating paper. And we're so indebted to Dr. Bevan Hoken, who assisted with this paper. Of course, he did his PhD on B12, so he works at the Sydney Adventist Hospital, and the head dietitian there at the hospital, Carol Zuchner, was the head author of this paper and worked with Bevan on it. So it is a nutrient that we need to pay special attention to. One important role of vitamin B12 is related to keeping our nervous system healthy. A deficiency can actually lead to damage of our peripheral nerves, so that's the nerve endings in your feet and your fingers and your toes, where you start to not feel anything. So you get symptoms like numbness, tingling of the hands and feet, decreased sensation, with difficulty walking, and also general weakness. There's also, because of deficiency, you may experience memory loss, dementia, depression, psychosis. So it's extraordinarily a serious problem. A deficiency of B12 in the diet can also lead to elevated homocysteine, which actually will increase a vegetarian's risk of cardiovascular disease. So you might say, oh my goodness, I've got heart disease, but I've been doing everything right all these years. Well, maybe you haven't been making sure that you've been including B12 in your diet, because when your homocysteine levels go up, which is a response to a low B12, or when B12 goes down, homocysteine goes up, and that causes increased risk of coronary heart diseases. So deficiency is mostly caused by inadequate absorption. For one, a lack of intrinsic factor, and that is associated with a condition called pernicious anemia. And people who have no intrinsic factor in their gut to help absorb B12 actually have to have B12 injections, because even if they took it by tablet or fortified foods, the body is just going to reject it. So they have to live on B12 injections. Also, loss of gastric acid. Now, as we get older, we don't produce as much of the good gastric acid in our stomach to digest our food. And one of the things that is a casualty of that is B12 absorption. So in America, which we are not doing here in Australia, they actually recommend that everybody over 50, whether they're a meat eater or not, should be supplementing their diet with B12, with a B12 supplement. And we'll talk about that a bit more in a minute. Another deficiency may occur because of inadequate dietary intake, and this is more likely to affect us as vegetarians or vegans, and particularly more so vegans, who tend to have much less, will have no animal product in their diet. and therefore no B12. A vegan diet must, if they don't have fortified foods and supplements, they will have inadequate intake. It can actually take many, many years for a B12 deficiency to develop, as our requirements are actually very, very small. They're only micronutrients. So about 2.4 to 2.6 micrograms of B12 is required a day. And our body is actually extraordinarily clever and efficient in recycling B12. So that's why it can take quite a number of years to develop a deficiency. But once a deficiency occurs, it's a real serious problem and has to be addressed right away, and otherwise irreversible damage may occur, particularly to your nervous system. Now, a little bit more just to explain what B12 is. It is actually produced by a microorganism. So it's actually a bacteria. Now, washing fruits and vegetables actually removes that bacteria. So we are all very pedantic about doing that, and so we're actually washing off the B12 along with other bacteria, which I will continue to do, I have to say. I have other ways of getting my B12, as we'll discuss. We actually produce some B12 in our gut, but it is actually way too far down in our gut to absorb. Animals also produce B12. They actually get the B12 from the soil as they're eating the grass. They're picking up B12, and it is incorporated into the animal flesh, and that's why animals or meat actually includes B12. Whole plant foods are actually not a reliable source of vitamin B12. You won't find B12 in plant foods such as spirulina. There's a Swiss bottle of spirulina that actually says it includes B12. It has what's called an inactive form of B12, which is actually no use at all to the body, and actually will block the absorption of active B12. So don't fall for thinking you're going to be getting plenty of B12 from your spirulina tablets that you might be taking. It's also not in fermented foods like tempeh or miso. There are traces found in mushrooms, and this is a fairly recent piece of research that's been done here in Australia. But unfortunately, the amount in a serve of mushrooms, which is about 3 button mushrooms, is so small, it's only about 5% of your daily requirement, which is almost nothing. So it's not reliable at all. Reliable sources come from foods that are fortified with vitamin B12 or supplements, which are tablets of B12. Now, taking these reliable sources is extremely important while you're pregnant or breastfeeding your baby. If you don't do that, then the baby is actually going to suffer and become deficient themselves. Supplements that you take should be supplements that are fairly small doses and take them often, because your body actually absorbs it a lot better if it's a smaller dose and not a very large dose like 1,000 micrograms. You actually will absorb some because of the actual push or the load, but you're going to lose a lot as well. So you're actually paying for something that is not staying in your body. Personally, if you're well, maybe it's okay for you to know what I actually use myself. I'm over 50, obviously, so it's important for me to have B12 in my diet, and I recommend this to people all the time. I certainly use a lot of fortified foods because I use soy milk, which is so good, which is fortified with B12 and other fortified foods. But I also will include the Berocca or the Supradin effervescing tablets, which are your B vitamin tablets. So it's got other B vitamins in it and some other, but it's got very small amounts of B12, about 10 micrograms. So that's just about perfect for helping your body to absorb the B12 that you need. If you have more questions about that, I'll be very happy to chat with you later. Supplements or fortified foods, as I've just said, were very important during pregnancy and breastfeeding. The B12 is efficiently recycled by the body, but B12 stores they last for years without B12 in the diet. Sorry, this is a little bit of repetition, and it takes many years to become deficient. But breastfed babies born to B12 deficient mothers will have very minimal stores. It's terribly important during pregnancy that mum ensures that she has B12 in her diet. Without it, you will have serious concerns when the baby is born. Clinical signs of deficiency can actually start within weeks of birth. Now, this B12 paper is actually has some excellent information, very detailed information for doctors on how to assess vitamin B12 status, because often it is a little complicated, and it's not just as easy as, well, you know, you can take a diet history and find out if the patient or the person or yourself is actually eating foods that are B12 rich or fortified or taking a supplement. A lab test is actually much more accurate than doing just a diet history. Serum B12 test is the most common test that is done, but it doesn't unfortunately measure your reserves. So it doesn't say whether you're actually now becoming low on reserves. On the other hand, serum homocysteine is actually a marker for B12 stores. When B12 stores goes down, as I mentioned before, homocysteine levels will actually go up. And as I've just said, that actually puts you at risk for heart disease. So a serum homocysteine test is a very, very useful test for your stores of B12. But the other two tests that are highly recommended by Bevan Hoken, and he tells me that this isn't always available everywhere. There's two called the TC2 and the MMA test, which I've marked in red there at the bottom. These are the best tests of all because they actually will indicate the earliest signs of deficiency in your body stores. Okay, I think I'll just skip over that. Other than just to say at the bottom, you really do need to make sure that you check your B12 status regularly. So ask your doctor. If you haven't had it done for some time, be sure to have them do a blood test for you. Extremely important. So some sources of B12 include, of course, your dairy foods, but also your fortified soy. Some rice milks are fortified. Your vegetarian sausages, so Sanitarium does fortify a lot of foods. I think I made up a list once of all the fortified foods, and it was really quite remarkable. So many of their foods are fortified with B12, including good old Marmite. Okay. So, there we go. So, it's important for lacto-ovo-vegetarians, so if you do drink milk, you will get enough of your B12 from a glass of milk plus a tub of yogurt plus an egg and a piece of cheese. That will give you what you need in terms of your RDI. But for vegans, 2.5 glasses of fortified soy milk is required to get your requirement for the day. And you will also get some from your burgers and your sausages if you like. Now, if you think you're not getting enough from those foods or not eating enough of that, you need to be sure to be taking a supplement. Oh, and I should say, the B12 from that you get from fortified foods like soy milk, burgers and so forth is very, very, very easily absorbed into the body. So even if you're over 50, you're going to be able to absorb that, which is really quite remarkable. Okay, so the fact is that B12 is available. It's available in milk and eggs in a lacto-ovo-vegetarian diet and also in fortified plant products. All right, so let's look at calcium. And now I have to say that unfortunately, because of limited space, we had to choose what nutrients to cover in our publication. Calcium would have been one we would have loved to have put in here, but we felt that the other nutrients were probably even more important. Probably one of the next papers that we will write is on calcium, and hopefully publish it. But so the information I'm giving you this afternoon on calcium and vitamin D, the same, we weren't able to include vitamin D. That information is actually in that paper I showed you yesterday, which some of you came and signed up for. It has actually got information on calcium and vitamin D in there along with the other nutrients, but very, very concise and certainly not as comprehensive as this here. So let's look at calcium. Well, what the myth is that cow's milk is essential for bones. In other words, you've got to get your calcium from there. Calcium's role, certainly it's important for growth, for maintenance and strength of our bones and our teeth, for even our nerves and our muscle function, for blood clotting, for hormones, for enzymes, blood pressure control, all kinds of things. We only usually think of it as a bone nutrient, don't we? But it's required for lots of things. Particularly important during pregnancy and lactation and for growing children and teenagers. Now, research no longer shows that animal protein leaches out calcium from bones. So we used to think that a high meat intake, animal meat intake, actually was very detrimental to our bones because it would make the calcium leach out or leak out, if you like, and be excreted, and then make the bones more susceptible to osteoporosis. Well, unfortunately, we know better now. The research doesn't hold that up. It's possible that a higher protein diet is actually protective of bone mineral density, but we're yet to determine if plant protein is more protective than animal protein. And I'm going to make a guess that we're going to find it is, because plant proteins have lots of other nutrients that help to strengthen bones as well that animal protein doesn't have. Now, vegan diets are not associated with increased fracture risk, provided that calcium intake is sufficient and adequate. A lacto-ovo-vegetarian diet actually has similar calcium intakes to non-vegetarian diet. So here's some food sources of calcium. Obviously your calcium-fortified beverages, your hard tofu. They actually use a calcium-rich setting substance that makes the tofu actually quite high in calcium. And then your unhulled tahini, and then some wonderful vegetables and fruits like kale, your Asian green veggies like bok choy, broccoli, and even figs, fresh figs. Almonds, great source, Brazil nuts, and then your dairy, of course. So you need to aim for 2 to 3 serves of calcium-rich foods each day from a variety of sources, including plant and, if you like, dairy, but obviously you can go with the calcium-fortified soy beverages as I prefer to. And then you need to ensure that you've got adequate vitamin D, and that's what we're going to talk about next, because vitamin D actually helps your body absorb calcium. You need to be sure that you limit your salt intake, caffeine and alcohol, because they actually stop your body from absorbing, or you'll actually leach calcium out of your bones if you have a high level or high intake of salt and caffeine. You need to be more physically active. Being physically active means that your bones will strengthen. Weight-bearing exercise is really important for healthy bones and muscles. And then eat plenty of fruits and vegetables. And we're learning more and more that the phytonutrients in fruits and vegetables also have a bone strengthening role, which is amazing. So facts on calcium. Well, plant sources of calcium are very healthy for the bones. So cow's milk is not essential for bone health, but calcium is. Poor calcium intake will increase your fracture risk So particularly vegans need to be very, very careful that they're getting enough plant sources of calcium. So here's a picture, some foods, the tofu, the fortified soy milk, so good, your broccoli, some figs and some almonds. All right, let's go on to vitamin D. People think that vitamin D is just a problem for vegetarians, or more of a problem, they might say. Vitamin D deficiency is certainly a serious public health issue for all Australians, not just vegetarians. This is actually true globally, so it's not just an Australian issue. Now, the Australian Health Survey results, which were just released last week, state that there is around 1 in 4 Australians who have a vitamin D deficiency. This increases to about 50% in the winter months, especially for women. And fortunately, only a very small number, only 1%, have a severe deficiency. Vitamin D is known as the sunshine vitamin. It's actually a hormone, so it's wrongly named. It's a hormone. UV from the sun actually produces vitamin D in our skin. And so the best natural source of vitamin D is actually safe sun exposure. Only a few foods are considered natural sources of vitamin D, and in Australia only a few foods are fortified with vitamin D. There's a few more that are fortified in the US, but in Australia much, much less. Okay, so just a quick review. The role of vitamin D, its function is very important for bone health, as we've said. It actually helps to reduce the risk of falls and fractures, helps to strengthen bone, as we've said, important for our immune system, healthy skin, muscle strength even. And there's now some very interesting evidence around its role in cancer, autoimmune disorders, rheumatoid arthritis, even MS, type 1 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, perhaps even schizophrenia, cognitive decline and depression. Lots more research needs to be done on all of that, but there is some very interesting information coming through now. Vitamin D deficiency can actually lead to decreased bone density. And so that means you're increasing your risk of fracture and also muscle pain. And then, of course, that can lead to osteoporosis, which means reduced bone mineral density, or even osteomalacia, which is the softening of the bones, and rickets. Probably some of us are old enough to remember that rickets was a problem many years ago. Kids were given cod liver oil. Do you remember that, to try and stop the epidemic of rickets? Well, guess what? Rickets is coming back again. And it's mostly related to children who are from immigrants from overseas, where mums never get exposed to vitamin D because of their cultural, they have to cover up. So who are mostly at risk? Well, certainly the elderly who never get outside into the sunshine. Interestingly, those with darker skin. It's much harder, takes longer to produce vitamin D in dark skin. Those who are immobilised, again, can't get out so much, institutionalised, cover their body for cultural reasons, babies, anyone who has little or no sun exposure. So vegetarians are actually at no greater risk than non-vegetarians, because really, whether you're a vegetarian or not, you still have access to the sun. So the fact that it is a sunshine vitamin, of course the Cancer Council has something to say about that, because they've been telling us for years, haven't they? Slip, slap, slop. And that's probably contributed to our vitamin D deficiency. But that's fine. What they're suggesting to us, and this is corroborated by the vitamin D researchers, they suggest that during the summer months, all it takes is to expose your face and your arms for 6 to 7 minutes most days, mid-morning and mid-afternoon. That means no sunscreen. So that might mean if you're at home, You get out into the garden and you do some watering, and you make sure that you get some sunshine on your arms and your face. If you're at work, like we try to at work, we like to go for a morning and an afternoon 10-minute, 15-minute walk, and we always say we're getting our vitamin D. So it's a great way to do that. During winter, in the southern parts of Australia, it will take longer because of the position of the sun. So 40 minutes of sunlight will be necessary on as much bare skin as you can bear, as you can stand. Dark-skinned people will need 3 to 6 times more this amount. So for foods with vitamin D, as I said, there's very few of them. Soy milk, vitamin D fortified, very few of those. We are now, So Good is now fortifying with vitamin D. Takes quite a lot of work to get that approval through for SANS, but we are doing that. Vitamin D mushrooms. There are mushrooms that are being irradiated or zapped with ultraviolet light, or even if you put them out in the sunshine for a few hours, they'll be rich in vitamin D. Milk. There's some milks that are fortified, cheese, yogurt, etc. And then other sources are oily fish. So most Australians are unlikely to get enough from diet alone. We know that because of the deficiency issues. Sun is our best source, and if you can't get it from sun or supplemented or fortified food, then you need to have a supplement, a vitamin D supplement. And that might be something like 1,000 to 2,000 international units a day. But talk to your doctor about that, certainly get your vitamin D checked. So vitamin D is a concern for all Australians, not just for vegetarians. Now I'm just going to finish here on a quote from the Journal of the American Dietetic Association, written by our own Dr. Winston Craig and his colleague Reed Mangles. They've written the Vegetarian Position paper, which is a resource or a reference globally. So it's a very, very highly regarded paper that was published in 2009. And they say, as we finish, appropriately planned vegetarian diets, including total vegan or vegetarian diets, are healthful, nutritionally adequate, and may provide health benefits in prevention and treatment of certain diseases. Well-planned vegetarian diets are appropriate for individuals during all stages of the life cycle, including pregnancy, lactation, infancy, childhood, adolescence, and also for athletes. Now, I want to just finish right here on this, referring to the last article that we have in this journal. It's called Practical Tips for Preparing Healthy and Delicious Meals. And there are some excellent tips. We deliberately, Sue Rad and Dr. Kate Marsh wrote this paper to be a practical resource that doctors could photocopy and give to their patients. It actually includes that resource which helps with meal planning, so you can see that you need to have if you're going to be vegetarian, to make sure you have some plant protein, some whole grains, some veggies, some fruit, and some dairy or soy. In this paper, there's some meal planning ideas, some shopping tips, some cooking tips. So I'd like to just finish now. I'm just about done with my voice, I think. And I'm sure you're just about done. We're going to finish with some question time. Hopefully you've got some questions. We probably only have a few minutes for that. But I did want to just encourage you to go to the Sanitarium website. There's lots of excellent information there, including some meal plan, comprehensive meal plans for every age group in the life cycle. We did an extraordinary amount of work on doing some dietary modelling, and that's included in one of these papers in here, a link to it. But you can go straight to the Sanitarium website and it will show you those meal plans. Now, just before I take questions, I do want to acknowledge the people that worked with me on this project. Carol Zushner from Sydney Adventist Hospital, Dr. Rosemary Stanton, Michelle Reid from Sanitarium, Dr. Kate Marsh, who's a dietitian in Sydney, and Sue Rad, who wasn't unfortunately with us on that day. And also the co-authors, Winston Craig, Bevan Hoken, etc., some wonderful people who volunteered their time. Now there's the website link. If you'd like to write that down, you can go and access every one of these papers in PDF format. So they're very nice and they look pretty, and you can send them off to a friend if you'd like to. Okay, question time, and I need a drink of water. Can I get that from you? Thank you. All right, questions.
Do you have any thoughts on coconut oil?
Tomorrow.
Oh, okay, sorry.
That was easy.
My daughters are trying to give their children unprocessed foods as much as possible.
Great.
And they are giving up using margarine and taking on butter. They say it's more natural than margarine. What do you suggest?
I would go to something like hummus or avocado instead of butter as a spread for your bread. If they do want to use butter, then use just a very small amount of it. But she does need to know that there is saturated fat in there. If they're very, very, what shall I say, skimpy, that's fine. But if they use it, slather it, cook with it, that's a problem. Yes?
Dr. Neil Nedley talks about flaxseed or linseed oil
Yes.
in his depression recovery seminar. You've been mentioning around the oil versus the seed. Would you just expand on that a little?
Well, the seed is better because of what we talked about yesterday, the lignans that are included in the fibre of the seed itself. So you're going to get not only the omega-3 oil, but you'll also get the lignans, which are the phytoestrogens, which are also very helpful for fighting disease. So for that reason, it's better. If you want to go with the oil, you have to be sure, of course, that it's not, that it's refrigerated. Anytime you extract the oil from the seed, it's going to go rancid really quickly. So as long as you're quite sure it's not a rancid oil already, then that's fine. But my choice is to use the seed, the ground seed.
Angela, thank you very much. You've covered these topics extremely well, and I only wish to support you. Just wish to make a couple of comments. I have done the ACNEM course, and I find that a lot of what they present is very useful, but it needs to be screened, as you have done here, in conjunction with the information that we've been given as a church. And that, I think, is the best way of approaching what has been done. Okay. Secondly, as a quick comment, for people who may be wondering if they're zinc deficient, the taste test is a very good test, and also about 60% of people who are zinc deficient have little white spots on their fingernails and toenails, and if you see bright white spots, you can very quickly get that checked out also. But the other 40% don't tell you. Yep. Thanks.
Thank you, Merlene. Can you, can anybody enlighten me on the acne? Was it acne you mentioned? Can you talk to me about that later, maybe? Thanks.
There's more hands shooting up.
Could you tell me about the omega-3 6? I noticed the sources you gave were walnuts and soy, and they were both mentioned. Are they in balance? Like, is there? Isn't it true that you need more 3 than 6? And in those foods that are both listed on your, are they in balance?
That's such a very good observation. Yes, walnuts and soy both contain omega-6. And that's probably one reason why I choose to have more flaxseed and chia than possibly the walnut. But let's not forget that really the unprocessed omega-6 forms, like walnuts, like safflower seeds and so forth, the unprocessed form of it is really okay. It's really more the refined form of omega-6 that you need to be somewhat careful about and reduce. So you get that balance right. Yeah. Yes?
I don't want to talk on B12. I can't absorb B12 because I've had part of my small bowel removed. So I take it in liquid form under the tongue, subliminal. Mm-hmm. And I was having injections prior to that, and it seems to be doing the trick.
Great.
Okay.
Wonderful. Good.
All right, I'll take this one as the last one. I know there's more, but we'll take this as the last one.